Imagine a situation where a child's life hangs in the balance and the one who is supposed to help turns away because of hatred and prejudice. Yes, it's a reality that shocks everyone. A little girl whose smile knelt the coldest heart needed an emergency surgery, but on that day, a doctor's terrible and inhuman decision shocked the world. He refused to help because her skin was a different color. We know that such stories cause anger and pain. How could someone who swore to save lives become a symbol of hatred and discrimination? How could someone so oblivious to his oath that he put his ideology above human life? But justice did not delay. Doctors and colleagues were shocked, and this doctor faced the most shameful punishment. His career ruined, his reputation in ruins, and he was dishonorably banished. Now imagine yourself in this situation. How would you act if you saw this injustice? How would you react to such a blatant case of racism? We value you, our viewers, more than you can imagine. Each of your comments, each of your likes, and each of your opinions help our channel to grow and become better. Please write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching us from. It is sincerely important for us to know you, because without you our channel would not exist. You are our support, our inspiration, and the reason why we continue to tell important stories. Thank you for being with us. We do this for you, and because of you, you are truly important to us, and your participation helps spread our messages of equality and justice around the world. It was an ordinary fall day. Leaves were falling from the trees, covering the ground with a golden carpet, but within the walls of the hospital, there was an atmosphere far from the common beauty of the surrounding world. People in white coats ran through the corridors, and monitors wrote the fate of those who fought for their lives. But in one of the wards, a drama was playing out that would soon shock everyone. On a gurney in the intensive care unit lay a little girl named Aya. Her skin was the color of chocolate, her eyes were like stars, and her smile, even though she was in serious condition, could light up the darkest night. But now the smile was gone. Her tiny body, hooked up to wires and machines, was desperately fighting for life. Nurses fussed around her, trying to stabilize her condition before the surgeon arrived. Time was ticking away, and every second mattered. The girl was only 11 years old. Her parents, Marcus and Leela, stood in the hallway in despair, tears streaming down their faces. They prayed to God and every higher power that Aya would get a chance at salvation. Her childhood had not yet. Subscribe to Deeple Pro to edit this document. Visit www.deeple.com /Pro for more information. Being lived. Her dreams had not yet been realized, and the future she envisioned was fading with every heavy breath. Everyone was waiting for a surgeon who is considered one of the best in this hospital. His name was Dr. Phillips. In the past, he had performed many complicated surgeries that had saved more than one life. People believed in his golden hands, his knowledge, and his ability to do the impossible. But on the day when his help was needed most, he would become a symbol of hate, prejudice, and how racism can be monstrously aggressive, even in the most unexpected places. Aya fought for every breath. Her lungs were struggling, and her heart could stop at any moment. The tension in the ward was unbearable, and every medical worker knew that if the operation did not begin in the next few minutes, the girl had little chance. The doctors had been taught that the color of a patient's skin didn't matter, that saving a life should come first. But Dr. Phillips' bias and hatred would soon reveal the dark truth. When he finally entered the room, his eyes cast a cold stare over Aya, as if she wasn't a child but just something he despised. The doctor, who seemed to be the symbol of professionalism, suddenly frownsy, and something in his face changed. It was the moment when the girl's fate met with hatred, disguised under a snow-white coat. Dr. Phillips sighed heavily, and tension hung in the air. He slowly turned to the other doctors and spoke the words that will forever be remembered by everyone who was there. "I'm not going to operate on her. Let someone else take over." Shock and horror showed on the faces of the nurses and co-workers. No one could believe their ears. This wasn't just a violation of medical ethics. It was that purest, most ruthless act of discrimination and aggression. Aya's life didn't matter to him because her skin was a different color. This was the moment when the fragile line between human life and racist hatred was broken, and it was worth too much. Aya was an ordinary girl, whose life before this tragedy was full of happiness. Despite difficult circumstances, she grew up in a small house where there were no expensive toys or exquisite clothes. But the most important thing was the love of her parents. Marcus and Leila did everything they could to make sure their daughter was surrounded by warmth and care. They told her bedtime stories, organized small holidays on weekends, and Aya dreamed of becoming a doctor to save people like those kind doctors she had read about in books. On the day of the accident, Aya was playing in the yard with the neighborhood children. She was happy and carefree, laughing heartily, until suddenly she felt a sharp pain in her chest. Her little legs gave out and she fell to the ground, gulping for air that couldn't fill her lungs. Panic gripped the neighbors, and Leila ran out of the house when she saw her daughter writhing in agony. Aya was rushed to the hospital, where a real fight for her life began. Doctors immediately realized that her condition was critical. The girl had a congenital heart anomaly that no one suspected, and only emergency surgery could save her. At times like this, there should be no room for reflection, doubt, or bias, but it would soon become clear that this story would be marked not only by the fight for life, but also by the hatred that still lived in the hearts of some people in the 21st century. When Aya was brought to the emergency room, her eyes were full of fear. She didn't understand why her own body had failed her so badly. Her small hands clung to her mother's arms, in which she saw comfort, but Leila, herself torn by pain, could only repeat, "It's going to be okay, honey, it's going to be okay." But there was so much despair in her voice that even the walls seemed to feel the pain. The nurses hurried around, preparing the girl for surgery while the surgeons discussed a plan of action, but time was not on Aya's side. Her heart beat slower and slower, and each new beat was weaker than the last. Everyone realized that just a little more, and it would be too late. At that moment the door opened, and Dr. Phillips entered the room. He was tall, with a stern face, and his presence always commanded respect. But that day respect gave way to something darker. Philip's eyes, when he looked at Aya, were as cold as ice. He didn't see her as a child who needed his help. He only saw what his prejudice and hatred allowed him to see. He took a step closer, but stopped. There was a struggle inside him, which everyone could read on his face, but it was a struggle that was won not by a doctor, not by a human being, but by a racist, who until now had hidden his aggression under the mask of a professional. A girl who had yet to live and dream was now a victim of the hatred that had poisoned people's hearts for centuries. Phillips turned to Leila and Marcus, giving them a look of disdain. It was a look that said, "You don't deserve my time or effort." The parents, seeing that expression, shrank in pain and helplessness. They had no choice but to beg, to try to explain that their daughter was just a child, an innocent creature who didn't deserve to suffer. But the doctor wasn't listening. There was no more room in his heart for compassion. He turned away, and there was something unbearably cruel in that gesture. Aya, had clung to life until now, was now on the verge of death, not only because of her illness, but because of a hatred that seemed stronger than the oath the doctor had taken. That encounter with the little girl, her innocent face, her pleading eyes, and her last hope that crumbled in the moment will forever be remembered by all who were there. It was a day when racism and aggression became a death sentence for a child whose life should have been saved, but instead was put on the line by the hatred of one man. The noise of machines, reading pulse and oxygen levels filled the room, creating a suffocating sense of anxiety. Every sound was a reminder that time was running out. Aya lay there, her small chest rising and falling slowly and painfully. The nurses were no longer hiding their excitement. It was obvious that the girl urgently needed an operation. Her condition was worsening by the minute, and in her parents' eyes fear was becoming almost physical pain. As the doctors completed a quick assessment of Aya's condition, the chief surgeon, Dr. Miller, ran into the room. He quickly checked the girl's vitals and gathered the other doctors for an emergency meeting in the hallway. There was desperation in his voice. "We have very little time. Her heart won't make it if we don't start surgery immediately." Dr. Miller was an experienced specialist, but such a complex operation required two pairs of hands, and help was needed. All eyes turned to Dr. Phillips, who stood nearby with an expression of stony indifference on his face. He was one of the best cardiovascular surgeons in a hospital, and it was his expertise that could have saved Aya. But when Dr. Miller appealed to him for help, Phillips didn't flinch. He clenched his jaws as if fighting something inside him, and then slowly exhaled. "No," came his cold and unappealing judgment. The word sounded like a sentence. It echoed down the corridor, and everyone who heard it was shocked. The doctors and nurses were petrified, as if they couldn't believe their ears. Racism was at the heart of this refusal, and it was obvious. Phillips's gaze, his clenched fists, the contemptuous expression on his face, all screamed his hatred. Dr. Miller stepped toward him, his face contorted with anger. "What are you talking about? You know we could lose her without you," he exclaimed. Phillips replied with such icy detachment that his words sent shivers down the backs of all who stood near. "Let another doctor take her. I'm not going to touch that girl." He deliberately paused before the word girl, emphasizing his contempt. In those words was all the hatred latent in society, which came out in the most disgusting form. Leela, Aya's mother, stood by her side and could not hold back her tears. Her legs gave out and she fell to her knees. Her hands shook as she covered her face, unable to bear the thought of their daughter dying simply because someone failed to see her as human. Marcus, Aya's father, tried to contain the anger that was tearing him up from the inside out. He looked at Phillips with a desperation and anger that was hard to put into words. He knew that time was critically short and his daughter could die right here in front of him because of someone else's hatred. The doctors around them whispered. Judgmental glances were directed at Phillips, but no one dared to speak out loudly. It was a moment when the whole system seemed to succumb to prejudice and tacitly accept injustice. How many other children or adults have suffered for the same reason elsewhere, but no one spoke up about it? How many times did skin color determine who would be saved and who would be left to die? Phillips stared straight ahead, as if nothing that was happening concerned him. It was aggression in its most perverse form, not screaming, not rage, but the kind of absolute indifference that can destroy lives. He turned away and headed to the other end of the corridor, leaving everyone terrified. He seemed completely indifferent to Aya's fate, to her family, to the despair and pain he himself had created. Meanwhile, the girl, whose heart was getting weaker and weaker, remained in the ward where the life drained out of her drop by drop. The hospital where lives were supposed to be saved became a place where hatred killed an innocent child. And this was just one of the countless tragedies that play out every day in a world where racism continues its dark work of tearing fates apart. Time was merciless. The minutes dragged by, and every beat of Aya's heart was a reminder of her rapidly fading life. The machines in the ward beeped desperately, warning of falling vitals, and it was getting worse by the second. The hospital staff were professionals, but even they couldn't bear to see the little girl weakening before their eyes. Marcus and Leela were still standing in the hallway, clinging to each other in an attempt to support what was left of them. They watched the chaos, the bustle of doctors and nurses trying to do everything they could to stabilize Aya's condition, while the child's fate remained in the hands of a prejudiced man. The girl's father felt rage mixed with unbearable pain. He knew that if his daughter had looked different, had lighter skin, Dr. Phillips would have been in the operating room by now, preparing for surgery, not hesitating for a second. It wasn't just inaction, it was violence hidden behind an indifferent face. The racism that flourished here was not shouting nor aggressive. It was insidious, disguised in the form of rejection, and that rejection was no less cruel. Dr. Phillips seemed to take pleasure in watching as the system in which he served allowed his hatred to dictate who deserved life and who did not. A nurse named Sarah, a young woman with a good heart and a sense of justice, couldn't take it anymore. She walked over to Leela, trying to hold back her tears, and tried to comfort her, even though she realized that words would not help in such a situation. "We're still fighting," she whispered, but there was despair written in her eyes. She knew they needed a surgeon. They needed Dr. Phillips, but he had refused, and his refusal was imbued with a hatred that was so deeply rooted that not even human life could shake it. Sarah tried to quiet her trembling hands. It was hard for her to realize that she was working in a system that allowed doctors like this to continue practicing. This was a case that opened a festering wound of racism in the medical field. It showed that even in places where human life should be the most important value, There is a hatred that destroys not only destinies, but the whole essence of humanity. Dr. Miller was still trying to convince Phillips to come back. His voice sounded nervous, but there was still hope in it that his colleague would come to his senses. You do realize that a child's life depends on it, he said, trying to put the gravity of the situation into his words. But Phillips only looked at him coldly. There was not a shadow of regret or doubt in his eyes. It was an eerie, icy indifference that seemed to mock the very idea of compassion. I don't care, Phillips said quietly but firmly. There was so much contempt in his voice that it hung in the ear in a heavy, poisonous cloud. It was not a mere refusal. It was an open display of hatred, and in that moment, it became clear that this wasn't just a random burst of racism. It was part of his identity, his beliefs, which he considered more important than anyone's life. Marcus felt the rage boiling up inside him. His fists clenched, but he knew that no amount of shouting, no amount of threatening would change this man's mind. He stood there, shackled by powerlessness, and it was the most agonizing thing of all. Seeing your child die and realizing that someone just didn't want to save her because of the color of her skin was a pain that burned through his heart. At this time, Aya in the ward was struggling as hard as she could. Her eyes were closed, and her lips were whispering something that could be mistaken for a prayer or a call. Her childlike body, which had recently been enjoying life, was now on the brink. It wasn't just a fight against death. It was a fight against a hatred that killed as mercilessly as any physical illness. The doctors and nurses could only hope for a miracle, and each of them felt guilty that they could not do more. But they also knew that this pain was not just the suffering of one child and her family. It is a cry for help that should wake up society, uncover the hidden aggression and racism that kills from the shadows, and make the world take notice that human life should not depend on the hatred hidden behind a medical coat. Dr. Phillips stood at the end of the corridor, motionless and impregnable as a stone wall. There was not a shadow of doubt or regret in his gaze as he watched. He kept to himself, turning away from Aya's parents, from his co-workers, from the little girl whose life now hung in the balance. Everything that was happening around him didn't seem to touch him at all. His indifference was the epitome of the tragedy that was playing out right in front of everyone. Aya was just a child with dreams that may never come true. She wanted to be a doctor, to help people, to save those who needed help. But now her future, her hopes, and dreams were on the line because of one man whose hatred was stronger than his professional oath. His decision to refuse surgery was not a simple show of weakness. It was an act of deliberate racism, aggression veiled under the mask of cold, professional refusal. Dr. Phillips was a respected specialist whose hands had saved many lives. But now, the very hands that were supposed to give Aya a future remained folded across his chest, as if her life were nothing more than nothing to him. His success in surgery, his recognition in the medical community, all of it had lost its significance in light of his terrible decision. All of his accomplishments now seemed meaningless and empty. What did the life saved mean if a man was capable of such indifference to one child, simply because her skin was the color of chocolate? Nurse Sarah approached Phillips again. She had been young and hopeful when she started her career at the hospital. She had thought she had come here to work with people to whom every patient was equally important. But now she saw her faith in that system crumbling. Sarah's eyes were full of tears, but she tried to hold on. Dr. Phillips, I'm begging you, she said, her voice shaking. She's just a child. She doesn't deserve this. Phillips turned a face that showed no sympathy or pity. His voice was cold and detached. Sarah, I've made my choice. Let them find another surgeon. But everyone knew there was simply no time to find another doctor. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could anyone have been so cruel? How could you ignore a child's pain, suffering, and innocence when she needed help the most? Sarah felt her insides churning with rage and despair. She wanted to scream, to beat her fists against the walls, but she knew it wouldn't make any difference. Phillips was firm in his decision. His bias was so deep that not even a child's cries, not even a mother's tears could thaw his frowning heart. It was as if this man who had taken the Hippocratic oath had completely forgotten that he had once promised to save lives, regardless of the color of the patient's skin or background. Marcus, Aya's father, felt his rage and helplessness consuming him more and more. He wanted to approach Phillips, to push him off the pedestal they had placed himself on, but he knew that would only make things worse. He'd seen his daughter die, see her lose her chances for a future, simply because of one man's hatred. It was a trauma he might never be able to overcome. It was as if everything around him had slowed down. Sounds became muffled, people's faces blurred, and all Marcus could see was his daughter's life slowly ebbing away. He remembered Aya telling him about her dreams of becoming a doctor. "Daddy, I want to save people like you," she used to say with that childlike naivety and sincerity that could melt any heart. But now her dreams were crushed, her life left at the mercy of a man who refused to see her as an equal. All the while, Aya, lying in the ward, was struggling. Her small lungs could barely do that job, and her heart was beating ever weaker. She knew nothing of prejudice, hatred or racism. Her world was simple. There was room in it for dreams, playing with friends, and the fairy tales her mom read to her. She didn't realize that her life was on the line because of someone else's decision, because someone saw her not as a child, but as a symbol of something they hated. All of this was not just a story about a medical tragedy. It was a story about how racism and aggression can destroy the most sacred principles of humanity. It was a story of how one indifferent heart can cause the death of another. The air in the hospital corridor was saturated with despair and the expectation of a miracle that never seemed to happen. Aya's life was fading fast, but not because of some terminal illness or accident, but because of a hatred rooted in the depths of time. Racism, hidden and suppressed in some places, came out in its worst form, exposing what was still alive and eating away at society. Dr. Phillips stood aside, and though his denial sounded formal, everyone present understood that there was a terrible truth lurking in his words. His indifference to the dark-skinned child was not accidental or due to professional burnout. It was a conscious, blatant aggression that pierced the soul, seeing its consequences. He looked at Aya not as a patient, not as an innocent child whose life should be prioritized, but as a symbol of something he considered alien and unworthy. One of the young interns named Jason was watching, and his heart clenched with indignation. He had just begun his career in medicine, inspired by the idea of saving lives, the idea of equality and mercy. But now he was seeing those ideals turn to ashes before his eyes. How is this possible in this day and age? He thought, looking at Phillips, who stood with his head held high, as if his decision was absolutely justified. Jason felt the blood pounding in his temples. He wanted to scream, to challenge this blatant racism, but he was afraid his voice would be drowned out by a system that too often protected such people. Phillips had always been known as a man whose views seemed old-fashioned, but no one had ever thought they could reach this level of hatred. His conversations in the break room, his dismissive glances at patients with darker skin or a different ethnic background now seemed not just a personal opinion, but a deep-seated aggression ready to destroy human life. Nurses who heard him talk about the purity of medicine and how some people don't deserve to be treated equally used to brush it off, not wanting to stir up conflict. But now they saw it all in a new, terrible light. The entire staff knew that minutes were counting for Aya, but what could they do with the one who was most qualified refused to save her? Sarah, a nurse, couldn't take it anymore. She approached Phillips again, her face contorted with rage and pain. "How can you do this?" she whispered. "How can you look at this girl and see not a person, but just the color of her skin? She is a child. She's done nothing to deserve this." Phillips looked at Sarah with contempt. "She's not my priority," he replied coldly. His words were filled with such outright hatred that Sarah recoiled. This was more than just a rejection of the surgery. It was a declaration, as if Aya's life was less valuable, as if her existence wasn't worth his efforts. And that was the worst of it. How could medicine, which is supposed to stand for life and justice, allow such cruelty? At that moment, Leela, Aya's mother, saw what was happening. Her tears burned her cheeks and her hands trembled. She took a step toward Phillips, her voice breaking into a scream. "Please, she's just a child. My daughter. She hasn't even begun to live yet." Her pleas were filled with a pain that would break the heart of anyone with a shred of humanity. But Phillips only clenched his jaws. He didn't see his mother in front of him. Full of fear and despair, he saw a woman he despised, a family he didn't respect. Marcus, Aya's father, could no longer contain his anger. He walked up to Phillips and looked him straight in the eye. "You swore to save lives," he said, his voice shaking with restrained rage. "You swore to be a doctor for all, without distinction, NNL. You're killing my daughter with your own hands." But Phillips did not even flinch. His indifference, his grim certainty that he was right, was like a stab in the heart. This shadow of racism that hung in the air was not just a shadow. It was an aggression that was now becoming the cause of the destruction of life. Every person in that hallway was witnessing how hatred can become a weapon that can kill. It was a moment that should not have happened in today's world, but it did. And the consequences of this decision will be a reminder of how dangerous it is to allow racism to exist in the most important aspects of our society, even in places where human life should be sacred. Time passed, and every moment spent waiting was agonizing. The machines in Aya's room continued to beep and beep, as if shouting to everyone that the girl's life was slipping away. Doctors and nurses fussed, trying to stabilize her condition, but everyone understood. They urgently needed surgical intervention. Without surgery, chances were practically nil. Dr. Miller, who hadn't left the hallway all this time, felt cornered. He was older than Phillips and had known him for years. Never before had he seen such an overt display of racism in a hospital where the Hippocratic Oath was supposed to be inviolate. Dr. Miller sighed heavily and took one last, desperate step. He approached Phillips, trying to grasp his conscience. "Do you really want the death of a child on your conscience? Do you really want to be the one who let hate destroy an innocent life?" But Phillips did not react. His face was still impenetrable, his gaze still icy. There was no room in his heart for doubt, compassion, or guilt. It was a terrible truth. There stood before them a man for whom prejudice was more important than any professional duty, more important than life itself. He turned away, as if Miller's words had not even reached his consciousness. This indifference was more terrible than any cry. Everything in the operating room was ready for the procedure to begin. The operating lights shone brightly, illuminating the cold, sterile metal of the surgical instruments. The nurses held in their seats held back tears, realizing that the surgery might not start on time. The medical team was assembled, but a crucial element was missing: a surgeon capable of performing this complex operation. And that surgeon, Dr. Phillips, stood outside, refusing to act. Meanwhile, Aya's condition was getting worse. Her face was pale, her breathing was barely audible, and her heart was beating slower and slower. The girl was so weak that even her mother's cry could not wake her up. Aya was passing away, and nothing could change that except the surgery she didn't wait for. Her dreams, her childhood, innocence, all of it was fading away in the face of a hatred that was stronger than compassion. Leela, her mother, ran into the operating room without regard for rules or protocols. Her heart was being torn apart. She could hardly breathe from the tears and pain. "Please do something. Keep her safe. She means so much to us. She is all we have." Her voice shook with terror as she looked at the doctors who tried to comfort her. But there was emptiness in their eyes. There was nothing they could do without a surgeon. The system that was supposed to protect her daughter was now powerless. Aya's father, Marcus, was one step away from losing control. He watched his child die, and it wasn't just a physical passing. It was a passing poisoned by the poison of prejudice that was destroying his family's life. Memories of their bike rides together, of Aya drawing portraits of him with awkward childlike affection, of her dreams of growing up and becoming a doctor, flashed through his mind. In that moment, he wanted to scream, to thrash around in impotent rage, but he knew it wouldn't help. The other doctors began to whisper among themselves. They knew that if Phillips didn't come back, they would have to risk doing the operation themselves, even though none of them were as skilled as he was. Their gazes read judgment, pain, and fear. They saw how the hatred and aggression that might have been hidden or justified elsewhere was now overt and deadly. In Aya's room, the machines could be heard making increasingly alarming sounds. Time was up. The medics knew that if they didn't start surgery in the next few seconds, the girl would die. This was a moment that shouldn't have happened. Racism shouldn't have existed within these sterile, bright hospital walls where people swore to save lives. But it was here, and its consequences were deadly. Dr. Miller gathered all his will in his feast and looked at his team and gave the command to start the operation without Phillips. He knew it would be risky, that they could lose Aya for lack of skill, but he also knew they couldn't stand idly by. Tears of despair streamed down the nurses' faces, the doctor's hands trembling. This was a battle not only against the disease, but against a system that allowed racism to kill. And all of this was happening in front of Aya's parents. This was not just the tragedy of one family. It was a loud, heart-wrenching cry for the world to wake up and realize that hatred, which once seemed a relic of the past, continues to destroy lives in the most unexpected places. And it was a fight for the life of a child who could have been saved if only hate had not proven stronger than a human oath. The silence in the operating room became almost palpable, as if time itself had stopped, afraid to move forward and bring the inevitable with it. The nurses, surgeons, and even the trainees were all consumed with horror and despair as they watched how one man's decision could destroy the life of an innocent child. When Dr. Miller gave the command to begin the surgery without Phillips, fear gripped the entire team. Everyone realized that this could end in tragedy, but no one could just watch Aya fade away. Dr. Miller stood over Aya, his hands trembling. It wasn't from lack of experience, but from the realization that their best chance at saving the girl had gone the moment Phillips refused to enter the operating room. Miller tried to focus, to pull himself together, but every time he looked at Aya's lifeless face, his heart broke. He knew her death would be a stain on his soul, a stain that would never fade. Meanwhile, behind the glass walls of the operating room, Leela and Marcus were huddled together, as if trying to share the pain that was tearing their hearts apart. Leela was sobbing. Her tears wouldn't stop. Why, she whispered, though no one could give her an answer. Her child was dying because the world was too cruel. The racism they had once heard about and sometimes encountered was now what was taking their daughter's life. It was the pain that was burning her from the inside out. Her little girl, whose dreams had been as bright as the light of the stars, was now disappearing into that darkness. Marcus looked at his daughter, and his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to rush into the operating room, grab a scalpel, and do whatever he could to save Aya. But he knew his anger was powerless in this fight. His courage, his love for his daughter, could not save her from the hatred that had taken over. He was merely a witness to this tragedy, as if he was being punished for not being able to protect his family from the cruelty of the world. Outside the operating room, in the hallway, a group of medics had gathered. They stood discussing what had happened, their voices filled with judgment and fear. The young interns were shocked. How can this be? Is this really possible in this day and age? Whispered one of them. Another nodded, his eyes full of tears. We took an oath that was supposed to be above all things, but now we see that it means nothing to him. Their words were full of despair. They had come into medicine with the belief that they could save lives without discriminating between people based on skin color or background, but now they saw that belief shattered by reality. Philip stood in the far corner of the corridor, surrounded by a heavy atmosphere of condemnation, but there was not an ounce of remorse on his face. He knew that his colleagues were looking at him with anger, but it didn't bother him. In his gaze there was only the certainty that he was right. There was not a shred of humanity left in this man, only pride in his decision, as if he had proved to the world that his hatred was stronger than moral obligation and compassion. In the operating room, Dr. Miller and his team fought hard. Every step they took was drenched in desperation, every attempt to save Aya like a battle against time itself. But everyone knew the odds were tiny. The girl's heart was barely beating, and her body was too weak to withstand surgery without proper training and the best surgeon. When Aya's heart finally stopped, the pain that filled the room was almost palpable. Miller, with trembling hands, tried to bring her back to life, but his attempts seemed futile. He realized that they had almost no chance from the start, but he couldn't give up. Her breathless body lay before him, and he could hear Aya's mother sobbing outside the operating room doors as if her heart was being torn apart. The world seemed to stop, frowning, refusing to move on after this loss. Sarah, a nurse who was standing nearby, could not hold back her tears. She looked at Aya, whose life had been cut short so unfairly, so cruelly. It wasn't just a death. It was murder, driven by a hatred that had no place in this bright, sterile room. She clenched her hands, trying to understand how this could have happened. How did a system that should protect become the cause of destruction. Phillips heard the doctors outside talking about Aya's death. He knew many would blame him, but it meant nothing to him. He was proud of his principled stand, being blind to the fact that his hatred had killed an innocent child. There was not a shred of compassion in his heart, not a shred of regret. He was the epitome of how racism destroys lives, how aggression can be quiet but deadly. The tragedy of this story was not just the death of one child. It was a story about a world that still allows hate to determine who deserves to live and who does not. When Aya's heart stopped and resuscitative measures were unsuccessful, the operating room fell into a sepulchral silence. Dr. Miller, who had fought to the last for the girl's life, seemed to give up the second the monitor's frown on the continuous sound of the flat line. His hands shook as he lowered the scalpel and looked at Aya's breathless body. She was only a child. Her face seemed so peaceful and innocent. But Miller knew it wasn't peace. It was injustice, exposed and screaming in every corner of that operating room. The nurses tried to hold back their sobs. Sarah couldn't hold it and clamped her hand over her mouth and walked out of the operating room so her tears wouldn't interface with her colleagues' work. Her pain was not just for Aya, but for the whole world that allowed racism to creep into the most sacred places where lives were supposed to be saved, not ruined. She slumped against the wall, trying to come to her senses, but the tears kept flowing until her heart broke with the realization that an innocent child could have been saved if not for the hate. Dr. Miller looked at the team gathered around him. Their eyes showed not only fatigue, but deep pain mixed with anger. They knew they had done all they could, but it was hard for them to accept that this was not the fault of nature or fate, but of human cruelty. There was a silent condemnation in the air, a condemnation that what had happened should not have happened. In the hallway where Leela and Marcus were waiting, the news of their daughter's death came like a lightning strike. Leela screamed, her pain exploding outward, making the walls of the hospital shudder. She fell to her knees, unable to believe what she was hearing, her hands clutching at the floor as if trying to hold on to a reality that had suddenly become unbearable. Marcus, clenching his fists, felt the world crumble around him. His child, his little girl whom he adored, was now gone, and there was nothing he could do. All his efforts, his love, his protection, all of it was powerless before the hatred that had taken her away. Colleagues who witnessed this tragedy could not remain indifferent. Intern Jason approached Sarah, who was standing in the hallway trying to manage her tears. Is this possible?" he asked quietly, but his voice was full of rage. "We had to save her. She was a child." Sarah looked at him painfully. Her eyes were red with tears. "We live in a world where hate still kills," she whispered, her voice shaking with helplessness. "Even in our white coats, we can't protect those who need us when such evil stands before us." The doctors and nurses began together in a small group, discussing what had happened. Each of them had a heart that was now tearing with pain, and a conscience that could not accept what had happened. They knew they couldn't leave it without consequences. What Phillips had done was a crime against the very nature of the medical profession. He had broken his oath, betrayed the meaning of his work. Shock and bewilderment pervaded everyone. How could it be that within the walls of this hospital, where they had taken an oath to save lives without distinction, racism had so blatantly caused the death of a child? Meanwhile, Phillips was still standing in the hallway, his face as impenetrable as a mask. He heard Leela's screams, saw the nurses and doctors whispering, casting judgmental glances at him, but it didn't move him. He held himself confidently, his jaw clenched, and his eyes remained cold and indifferent. He knew his decision would cause resentment, but his hatred was deeper than any attempt to awaken remorse in him. There was no room in his heart for regret or regret. It was monstrous. It was the epitome of how racism and aggression can be deadly, even in the hands of someone sworn to protect life. Marcus, gathering the last remnants of his strength, walked over to Phillips. His face was contorted with pain and anger. "You killed my daughter," he whispered, but there was so much rage in his words that they sounded louder than a scream. "You killed her because you couldn't see the child in her. You only saw the color of her skin." Phillips did not flinch. He only raised his eyebrows slightly, as if this accusation was completely insignificant to him. It was the last straw for everyone present. Dr. Miller stepped toward Phillips. His hands shook with anger. His face was pale. "You betray everything we believe in," he said, and you could hear the hatred in his voice. "We're supposed to save lives, not destroy them. You let racism kill a child, and now we all have to carry that burden." Phillips only shrugged, and his indifference was insulting. There was not even a hint of remorse in his demeanor. He turned away and strode away, leaving a trail of judgment and hatred behind him. This hospital, where thousands of lives were saved, was now a place where one life was destroyed. It was a tragedy that showed the world that racism still destroys, still kills, still gives its victims the most cruel and unjust sentences. Leila's tears kept coming, like the incessant rain that pours down on the ground at the darkest hour. Her scream was so piercing that it seemed to echo throughout the hospital corridors, making the walls shudder. She clutched her hands to her chest as if trying to hold on to her broken heart, which now seemed to have lost its ability to beat. Her daughter, her little Aya, the one whose eyes had glowed with the joy of life, now lay breathless behind the cold walls of the operating room. The pain was so intense that Leila could barely breathe. Marcus, standing beside him, felt the world slowly falling apart. Everything he had once known and loved, everything that had been the meaning of his existence, was now crashing down on him like an avalanche of unbearable terror and powerlessness. His daughter was gone because of hate, because someone refused to save her, just because her skin was the color of chocolate. He remembered how Aya had held his hand as they walked in the park, how she used to tell him about her dreams and future plans with a smile, how her eyes always reflected hope and faith that the world was a place where something good was waiting for her. But the world turned out to be a much crueler place. Marcus fell to his knees beside Leila. His hands shook as he tried to hug her, to comfort her. But how could it comfort a mother who had lost her child? His own tears rolled down his cheeks, and a storm of rage and hatred reached in his soul. He wanted to scream. He wanted to destroy everything around him. He wanted to find justice, but he was helpless. He couldn't bring his daughter back, couldn't undo what had happened. Leila asked herself again and again, why? Why did her little girl deserve such a fate? Why was her life in the hands of a man whose hatred outweighed everything? She knew Aya didn't understand racism. She didn't know the world could be so unfair and cruel. To her, everyone was equal. Everyone was good in her childhood dreams. But this world had taken that faith away from her, robbed her of the chance to see the light, robbed her of her life. The scene was horribly tragic. The doctors and nurses passing by could not hold back their tears. They saw how this family had been destroyed, how pain had destroyed what was whole yesterday. The pain of the parents was unbearable, unspeakable. It was like an open wound that would never heal. It was a testament to how racism and aggression can destroy an entire universe contained in the heart of one child. Dr. Miller, who was still in the operating room, couldn't look at Aya's body without feeling the deepest guilt. He had done everything he could, but he knew it wasn't enough. He couldn't stop thinking about how things might have been different if Phillips hadn't said no. It seemed to him that this was not just a professional failure, but a deep, unforgivable betrayal of humanity. Miller covered his face with his hands and tried to hold back the tears, but they flowed anyway. It was a tragedy that would be remembered forever, a tragedy that had been caused not by accident but by human malice. Phillips, meanwhile, was slowly leaving the hospital. He walked down the corridor without looking back, and no one tried to stop him. The medics looked at him with contempt, with hatred, but he walked with his head held high, as if his actions were completely justified. He believed he was right, and his indifference was an insult to everyone who knew Aya, who loved her, who understood that she deserved to live. Marcus looked at this man who had taken his most precious possession from him, and he felt like he was suffocating. He wanted to lunge at him, wanted to hit him, wanted to make him feel a fraction of the pain he was feeling now, but he knew it wouldn't make any difference. He felt crushed, exhausted, stripped of his last shred of hope. His daughter had died because of hate, and no words, no actions would bring her back. Subscribe to Deeple Pro to edit this document. Visit www.deeple.com divided by Pro for more information. Aya's grieving parents, surrounded by medical staff who could do nothing, or the epitome of utter helplessness in the face of injustice. This tragedy was more than just one family story. It became a reminder that racism continues to take lives, that hatred continues to kill. This pain will live on in the hearts of the people who saw this death, and in the hearts of all those who will realize that hatred, disguised as indifference, can be the cruelest and most ruthless force of all. After the tragedy, the hospital fell into a heavy silence. It was as if Aya's death had left a gaping wound that had grown to consume everyone there. Doctors and nurses walked the hallways with devastated looks, unable to fully comprehend that it had actually happened. It seemed that the walls, once filled with the sounds of life and hope, now held only pain and the mute cry of injustice. The blatant case of discrimination shocked everyone. The rumor that Dr. Phillips had refused to operate on Ida because of her skin color spread through the hospital faster than fire. The medical staff was divided into two groups: those who were outraged and demanded justice, and those who tried to justify or at least understand the actions of their colleague, even if not out loud. But most of the doctors and nurses could not contain their anger. They knew that this was an inexcusable violation of all ethical norms, a violation of the very essence of what it means to be a doctor. Sarah, la nurse, could not stand still. She replayed over and over in her head the moment when Phillips had refused to enter the operating room. It pained her to realize that she worked in a system that still allowed such occurrences. She knew that no one expected to see racism in such a blatant, deadly manifestation here at the hospital, where they were all sworn to save lives, where they believed their work should serve all humanity, regardless of color, creed, or background. A young intern, Jason, who witnessed everything, felt his faith in medicine crumbling. He came into the profession with the belief that doctors and nurses were the ones who fought for everyone's life, who helped the most vulnerable. But now he saw that even in the holiest of professions, there was room for evil. Can you live with this? He whispered to himself, his hands trembling with helplessness. He couldn't forget Aya's face, her innocent eyes that would never open again. The morning after Ida's death, the hospital was in a frenzy. The media got wind of what had happened, and reporters flocked to the hospital like vultures trying to get comments from the medical staff. Whispers and sighs filled the hallways. Journalists asked, "Is it really true? Did a child die because of a doctor's racist refusal?" The questions sounded like blows to a sore wound, but the pain was real, and the truth could not be hidden. Leela and Marcus, distraught with grief, Saturday in the small room for patients' families, where they had once dreamed of hearing good news about their daughter's recovery. Instead, they now Saturday in an icy void, surrounded only by their own despair. Leela could no longer cry. She was exhausted. Her body was exhausted, beyond repair, and her eyes were swollen with tears that no longer remained. She stared into nowhere, her gaze blank. Her girl, her bright ray, was dead, and she died not because of illness, but because someone could not overcome their hatred. Marcus Saturday beside her, clenching his hands into fists. He wanted to scream. He wanted to destroy this world that had treated his daughter so cruelly. How can you justify this? He asked himself, looking at his wife, who had lost not only her child, but the meaning of life. He realized that this was not just a tragedy for their family, it was a blatant case of discrimination that was now out in the open for all to see. He knew that justice for Aya might never come. The system they thought was fair now seemed rotten and cruel. The doctors who had worked side by side with Phillips for years were shocked. Dr. Miller could no longer remain silent. He gathered his colleagues in a conference room and, struggling to contain his anger, said, "We cannot turn a blind eye to what has happened. This is not just a professional error. This is a hate killing." He swore an oath to save lives, not let racism destroy them. His words were met with cheers of approval, but a heavy sense of responsibility hung in the air. Everyone now knew they had to do something, but what could be done to right such an injustice? Pain and anger engulfed the hospital. It was a place where racism came to the fore, where bias killed an innocent child. This tragedy was not just a personal story of a family, it was a reflection of a system that has tolerated hate for too long. It was a call to action, a call to fight for justice to become real. But even if they found justice, nothing would bring little Aya back. And that was the bitterest truth of all. The heavy realization that the oath every doctor took could be trampled and forgotten pierced the hospital like a cold wind. When Dr. Phillips refused to save Aya, everything they believed about their calling was shattered. The promise to save lives without prejudice or preference, the promise to be advocates for the most vulnerable now sounded like a mockery. The Hippocratic Oath had become mere empty words to all who worked in this institution. If they could let that happen. Dr. Miller Saturday in his office, holding a small photograph of his own children. They were his pride, his joy, his meaning of life. He thought about how easily one man, full of hate, could destroy someone's family, ruin a child's dreams and future. Miller thought back to the moment when he first took the Hippocratic Oath. He was younger, full of enthusiasm and faith in medicine as the most noble profession. It seemed to him then that in his hands he would have the power not only to save lives, but also to make the world a better place. But right now, he felt like a traitor. He had watched Aya die, and though he had done his best, he knew it wasn't enough. Her death was not inevitable. It was the result of a conscious choice by a man who refused to do his duty. Dr. Miller ran his hands over his face, trying to deal with the heavy pain. His heart was bursting with guilt. He knew he should have done more, should have done something to prevent this terrible outcome, but he couldn't. A doctor's oath sounded noble, but today it was something empty, devalued. In this hospital, where they swore to protect and treat everyone, Aya was left to die. Questions multiplied in the minds of the medics. What now? How could they go back to work as if nothing had happened, as if their profession was still sacred and pure? The oath that was supposed to be a guiding star was now overturned and trampled by the dirty reality of racism. Sarah, who hadn't been able to settle down since yesterday, came home and couldn't sleep. She Saturday on the floor of her living room, wrapping her arms around her knees and rocking back and forth. She thought back to her first week in the hospital, where she had been mentored on how to save lives. She'd been told how to be resilient, how to act with clarity and coolness even in the most critical situations, but nothing had prepared her for the fact that pain and hatred could be so devastating. She felt the world she had built around her crumble. All her dreams of medicine, of humanity, were now undermined. She opened the medical book, the same one in which she had once read the Hippocratic Oath, and her eyes filled with tears. She ran her eyes over the lines. I will respect every human life from the moment of conception. I will treat the sick with compassion and care, without prejudice. Those words now felt like a mockery, an empty promise that failed to protect Aya. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she closed the book with a loud thud. What did it mean to be a doctor if an oath had no power in the face of hate? At this time, memories and gossips circulated around the hospital that Phillips had been racist before. Colleagues recalled his caustic remarks, his subtle but derogatory words to dark-skinned patients or non-English speakers. At that time, no one thought those words could turn into real tragedy. They brushed them off, thinking they were just unpleasant opinions that could do no harm. But now they were hate, even hidden, even spoken in a quiet voice in the break room, could become a weapon, and this time that weapon had killed a child. A meeting of the doctors was urgently called. People spoke loudly, almost shouting at each other, blaming, making excuses, arguing about what should be done. How could we let this happen? Someone asked, and there was bitterness in his voice. We vowed to save lives. How can we now look into the eyes of the people who believe in us? We allowed racism to penetrate the very heart of our profession, the doctors argued, and each felt part of something terrible, something they couldn't stop. Dr. Phillips, who had refused to participate in this meeting, Saturday in his office, knew he was being debated, but he didn't care. He felt sure that he was right. It didn't seem to him that he had broken his oath. To him, his personal views were more important. His indifference to the fact that his hatred had led to the child's death was as devastating as his very refusal to operate. He felt himself above all the talk, above all the accusations. But everyone in the hospital knew this wasn't just the failure of one doctor. It was the failure of an entire system that allowed hatred to override the Hippocratic Oath. Within days, the hospital was at the center of a storm. Rumors of Aya's death spread far beyond its walls, and soon the news of the tragedy reached the general public. The story of how the doctor refused to save the child's life because of her skin color resonated powerfully. People were shocked and enraged. Anger and outrage filled social media, turning the hospital into the epicenter of a universal discussion about racism and injustice. Aya's parents, Leela and Marcus, remained in a state of deep shock and grief. They could not understand why the world had turned out to be so cruel. Marcus kept remembering moments with his daughter, her laughter, her talks about the future, her dreams of becoming a doctor. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the smiling face, and the loss became even more unbearable. He felt crushed, but he knew he couldn't just stay silent. On the fourth day after the tragedy, Leela and Marcus, despite their pain, agreed to be interviewed by a local news station. They knew the world needed to hear their story. Marcus Saturday in front of the camera, his face stern and haggard. His voice shook as he said, "My daughter was a child. She didn't deserve to die like that. She didn't deserve to have her life taken because of hate. We entrusted her to the doctors because we thought they would fight for her, that they would protect her no matter what. But it turned out that her skin color was more important to someone than her life." Leela Saturday next to him, her eyes dry, all the tears had dried up. She was holding Aya's teddy bear, the one she slept with every night. "Our daughter dreamed of a future that will now never happen," Leela said, and her voice sounded so quiet it seemed her words could have been carried away by the wind. She was full of love and hope. She believed in the goodness of this world, but this world turned out to be too cruel. The words of Aya's parents shocked millions of people. Their pain was felt even through the screen, and it made many people think about how racism continues to destroy lives. Protests began to erupt across the city, and people took to the streets with placards. "Justice for Aya. Medicine should save, not kill. No hate in our hospitals." It was a movement full of rage and pain, a movement that demanded change. A huge crowd of people gathered in front of the hospital. They chanted slogans and laid flowers at the entrance of the hospital in memory of Aya. People of different ages, colors, and religions came to express their outrage and demand justice. Among the protesters were health workers from other hospitals who could not stay away. They stood alongside ordinary citizens holding banners. "We took an oath to save everyone, and medicine should not be racist." Sarah, a young nurse, watched from the hospital window. Her heart ached with pain and guilt at the same time. She knew that this crowd was here for a reason. People were demanding justice for a girl who should have lived. They were screaming on behalf of those who could no longer speak for themselves. Sarah realized that they were fighting to make sure something like this would never happen again. Dr. Miller stood beside her, his face pale and tired. "They're right," he said quietly. "We should have been the best. We should have protected her, not let hate win." His words sounded like an admission of guilt, but they were full of powerlessness. The system they worked in wasn't strong enough to protect the innocent, to stand up to something that should have been eradicated long ago. Phillips, meanwhile, took refuge in his house, where the doors were locked and the curtains were drawn tightly. He knew that his name had become a symbol of disgrace, that his actions were now being discussed throughout the city and beyond, but there was not an ounce of remorse in his heart. He felt victimized by this anger, as if the world had unfairly targeted him. It seemed to him that his act was justified and that his hatred had a right to exist. Nevertheless, the public outcry continued to grow. People demanded punishment, reforms in medicine, changes in laws. Aya became a symbol, a reminder that even in modern societies, hatred can still destroy lives. People knew that this tragedy should not be forgotten, that the pain it caused should be a catalyst for change. All this time, the hospital remained in the spotlight. Patients were afraid to come here, doubting that their lives would be saved if they were of the wrong skin color. This mistrust, this wound to the entire community, was yet another tragedy caused by the actions of one man. The anger and pain spread far beyond the hospital. Aya's story epitomized all the injustice that continued to live in society. Even though everyone believed in progress and equality, the protests that started at the hospital gates soon spread throughout the city. People took to the streets with tears burning in their eyes and rage in their hearts. They held placards bearing words like "Racism kills," "Justice for Aya," "Doctors who swore to save should not kill." The crowds grew larger and larger, and the protesters were joined by human rights activists, families whose loved ones had ever experienced bias, and those who were simply sympathetic. There were those who had experienced racism in many different forms, who knew what it meant to be excluded, to be on the margins of a system that is supposed to protect. They chanted slogans, demanding change and justice for Aya, whose life had been so cruelly and unjustly taken away. Leila and Marcus attended these protests despite their unbearable pain. They stood in the front rows, clutching a picture of Aya, a little girl with a radiant smile who dreamed of a future she would now never have. Leila was barely on her feet, but she was supported by Marcus, who, despite his own pain, tried to be a support for his wife. They were surrounded by people who chanted to their daughter, "We will not forget. We will fight." These protests were filled with emotion and mixed anger, grief and determination. People knelt in remembrance of the girl whose skin color caused her death. They lit candles and laid flowers at a makeshift memorial outside the hospital. It was a place of grief and hope that their voices would be heard. But it was also a place where many realized how deeply entrenched racism remains in a system where it should not have been. Meanwhile, videos and photos of the protests appeared on social media and went viral around the world. Aya's story resonated with millions of people, and hashtag Justice for Aya became a global trend. People in different countries began sharing their stories of racism and discrimination in the medical field, recounting the pain they experienced. Aya became a symbol. Her name was spoken with respect and bitterness, and her death was recognized as a tragedy that should not have happened. Police monitored the protests, fearing possible outbreaks of violence. Fortunately, the demonstrations remained peaceful, but tension was in the air. People demanded concrete action, firing Dr. Phillips, investigating him, changing laws that allowed doctors to avoid accountability for their biased actions. They demanded reform so that medicine would no longer be a field for hatred and discrimination. Dr. Phillips could no longer hide. His name had become a household name, a symbol of how a man trusted with life could cause death. His house was surrounded by reporters, and he had to wade through a crowd of people who denounced him. Some of them shouted his name with hatred, others with pain. He avoided the cameras, covered his face with his hands, but nothing could hide what he had become in the eyes of the public. People demanded that he answer for his actions, but Phillips remained silent as a stone, refusing to admit guilt. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was no less tense. The doctors and nurses felt crushed. The system they had served was now being questioned, and their work seemed meaningless if they could not protect the most defenseless. Some of them began writing open letters, expressing their outrage and supporting demands for change. They knew they had to be honest. Medicine was not free from bias. That had to change. Sarah, a young nurse, finally decided to speak publicly. She gave an interview in which she tearfully admitted, "We saw Phillips' hatred. We knew he was biased, but we never thought it would go this far. We failed to protect Aya, and now this will be our burden for life. But we must not remain silent. We have to fight to make sure something like this never happens again." Sarah's words resonated strongly, and many health workers began to share their stories of instances where hate and bias had interfered with their work. People began to realize that this was not just an isolated incident. This was a systemic problem, and it would take decisive action to solve it. The protests continued, and the pressure on the hospital and the medical community increased with each passing day. People demanded not only justice for Aya, but also changes that would make medicine safe for everyone. There was a feeling in the air that this tragedy should be a turning point, that Aya should not die in vain. And even though pain, anger, and grief clutched people's hearts, they knew they had to keep fighting for her name, for all those who suffered from hatred that should not have taken place in a world where everyone deserves care and respect. Soon after Aya's story went public, the pressure on the hospital and its staff reached its peak. Public demands grew louder and louder, and hospital officials were forced to launch an internal investigation into how such a tragedy could have occurred. It was time for Dr. Phillips' colleagues, those who had seen his work and heard his words, to speak out. The medical team gathered in the conference room of the hospital. The atmosphere in the room was heavy and tense. like before a thunderstorm. People Saturday nervously, looking at each other and whispering to each other that the moment of truth was coming. They knew they would have to tell the truth about who Phillips was and that they had tolerated his hatred for too long. Dr. Miller, gray-haired and tired, was the first to rise. He looked into the faces of his colleagues, and his eyes were filled with pain. He felt that he shouldered the responsibility for what had happened, even if he wasn't the one who had refused to operate on Aya. "We knew," he began, and his voice was full of bitterness. "We knew that Phillips was a man with prejudiced views. He had spoken out more than once about his beliefs. We heard him speak contemptuously of patients of color, but we thought they were just words. We never expected he could go to such lengths." Nurse Sarah, who Saturday in the front row, listened to those words, and tears came to her eyes again. She knew Miller was right. They had all heard Phillips' remarks, how he talked about the purity of medicine, about worthy and unworthy patients, how he laughed at those who needed help but, in his opinion, didn't deserve it. But at the time, it seemed like something abstract, something that would never become a real threat. Now his hatred had caused the death of a child, and realization was devastating. The young intern Jason, who still felt guilty for not being able to stop Phillips, decided to speak up as well. His voice shook as he began. "I remember him ridiculing patients who didn't speak English. I remember him saying he wasn't going to waste his time on those who, in his words, don't belong in this society. We heard this, but we were afraid to speak. He was a respected surgeon, and it seemed to us that there was nothing we could do. But we were wrong. We had to stand up for those he despised." One by one, Phillips' colleagues shared their stories. Nurses recalled how Phillips ignored the requests of dark-skinned patients, how he refused to attend emergency calls if he thought a patient was not worthy of his time. Doctors said they were afraid to confront him for fear of repercussions, and that the system in which they worked encouraged silence rather than confronting bias. It was a confession that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Each testimony revealed new, horrifying details of how hatred could exist at the very heart of a profession designed to save lives. It was a collective failure, and everyone knew it. A truth was revealed that was bitter and painful. They were all part of a system that had failed to protect a little girl. Each of them felt guilty. Each of them realized that silence was tantamount to complicity. Meanwhile, Leela and Marcus, Aya's parents, were in the waiting room, sitting in heavy silence. They did not know that at this very time Phillips' colleagues were talking about his hatred. They just Saturday, they're holding each other, consumed with pain and despair. For them, that pain was eternal. It seemed to them that the world had failed to protect their daughter, and now all they had to do was watch as all these people try to atone for their sins in the face of the horrifying truth. By the time the meeting was over, the atmosphere was heated to the max. Dr. Miller stood up again, his voice punctuated by tears. "We can't change the past, but we can make sure it never happens again. We must reform the system. We must fight the hatred that happens to still be alive among us." His words were met with silence, but that silence was filled with realization. All this time Phillips stayed home, avoiding confronting what he had caused. He watched the news and saw his co-workers begin to publicly condemn him. Deep down he felt besieged, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit guilt. He couldn't understand why people hated him so much for an act he thought was justified. But the truth was undeniable. His hatred, his refusal to operate on Aya, his indifference to her life, all of it had caused the girl's death. And now everyone knew it was no accident. It was a conscious choice, made on the basis of hatred and racism, that destroyed a family and took the life of an innocent child. The public demanded justice, but people knew that no measure would bring Aya back. It was a reminder of how deep-seated prejudice still kills, how indifference and silence can be as dangerous as hatred itself. Soon after Dr. Phillips' colleagues came forward with their testimony, an official investigation began. Events unfolded rapidly, and the hospital became a battleground for justice. Law enforcement officials and medical inspectors arrived on the scene to begin questioning and examining the full circumstances of the tragedy. Documents were seized, and the hallways, usually filled with the sound of footsteps and talk of saving lives, were now drowned out by talk of death and injustice. There was now an oppressive silence in the operating room where Aya had died. This place where people were supposed to be saved had become a symbol of loss and pain. As nurses passed by, their eyes lowered, unable to bear the memory of a child dying before their eyes because of a doctor's refusal to do his duty. The walls themselves seemed soaked with tragedy, and the hospital was no longer seen as a place where people could find hope. Inspectors began interviews, asking everyone who had witnessed that day to understand how hatred could have gone so far. Sarah, a nurse, came to the interrogation with a heavy heart. She had to recall over and over again the moment when Phillips refused to enter the operating room, when his cold stare said more than any words could. She told the inspectors how often he had made racist remarks, how he had looked at dark-skinned patients with contempt, how he had refused to take them seriously. The words came out of her mouth with bitterness, and every time she spoke, Aya's face came into view. Dr. Miller, who was also to testify, felt his heart clench hard. He talked about how he had tried to convince Phillips to operate, how he had heard that terrible no, which had not a shred of doubt in it. Miller knew he could never forget that moment. He knew he was powerless in the face of a hatred that was stronger than professional duty. As he finished his testimony, his voice trembled. He had been a doctor all his life, but now he felt like a traitor who had failed to protect a little girl. Hospital management was in a panic. Recruiters and lawyers tried to protect the reputation of the institution, but they knew the situation was getting out of hand. The hospital building became the center of a scandal, and everyday protesters gathered at its gates demanding justice for Aya. Posters with her face and words "too young to die" hung on the walls as a reminder that nothing is more important than human life. Aya's parents, Leela and Marcus, couldn't believe that the investigation had only started after their daughter had died. They felt it was just as delayed, that no one would side with them the way they should have, but they also realized that they had to follow through. They spoke at every event, met with activists, told their story over and over again so that the whole world could hear how one hate could destroy the future. Their faces were haggard, but determination burned in their eyes. They knew that justice for Aya would be their last hope. Phillips was also summoned for questioning, but his behavior shocked everyone. He appeared accompanied by a lawyer who tried to defend him against all the charges. Phillips was calm, even arrogant. He stated that he refused to operate on Aya not because of her skin color, but because of an unprofessional situation and a personal emotional state that allegedly prevented him from acting. His words sounded like a mockery to everyone who knew the truth. Everyone knew it was a lie, but his lawyer tried to protect his reputation. Leela, upon hearing these statements, was stunned. How could one justify hatred? How could anyone try to twist things to make the murderer a victim? She stood in the square, surrounded by protesters, and held a picture of Aya in her hands. Her voice shook with tears as she spoke into the microphone. No one has the right to decide whose life is more important. No one should die because someone is unable to overcome their hatred. Her words were met with cheers of approval, but deep down she knew it wouldn't bring her daughter back. The investigation then covered more and more instances of Phillips showing his hatred. Patients told of how he disregarded their requests, how they felt humiliated and helpless. Facts surfaced about his previous refusals to treat people with dark skin, about complaints that no one took seriously. All of this was evidence that racism in this hospital was not an accident, but a systemic problem that no one wanted to acknowledge. Each new discovery made Aya's tragedy even more horrifying. It wasn't just the death of a child, it was a death that could have been prevented if people had been willing to fight hate instead of turning a blind eye to it. As the investigation deepened, the truth about Dr. Phillips was even more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Over the years of his practice, numerous complaints had accumulated from patients and their families who felt rejected and humiliated. However, these complaints were systematically ignored or silenced by hospital management, revealing a much deeper problem than just the actions of one man. Within weeks, human rights lawyers and independent activists joined the investigation to shed light on this systemic problem. They uncovered documents that had previously been hidden in archives, complaints of racist remarks, records of Phillips refusing to treat patients from certain ethnic groups. These complaints sometimes even reached management, but were never taken seriously. The hospital preferred to keep silent for fear of scandal, and this silence led to the tragedy that took Aya's life. The stories of staff who were afraid to speak openly also came to light. One nurse, an elderly woman named Gloria, finally decided to share her story. Her voice trembled as she recalled, "I remember him, Phillips, calling patients unclean and unworthy of our efforts. I once heard him laugh about a dark-skinned patient dying of complications and say it was a natural selection. I was afraid, but I never thought his hatred could kill a child." Other doctors and nurses began to share their memories. They recounted instances when Phillips had blatantly ignored patients, refused to explain diagnoses, and walked away, leaving them bewildered and afraid. Each new story was like a knife in the heart of those who still hoped that medicine remained a sphere of mercy and equality. But it turned out that even here, hatred could run deeper than many could have imagined. When reporters learned how the hospital covered up Phillips' actions, the scandal grew even bigger. Aya's parents, Leila and Marcus, were destroyed by the new details. They never knew what kind of man stood at their daughter's bedside when he made the decision not to save her life. Marcus, whose heart was bursting with pain and rage, couldn't find his place. He paced back and forth in their small house, his fists clenched and his eyes full of tears. "We trusted a system that was supposed to protect her," he said, his voice full of rage. "They knew what he was like. They knew he hated people like us, but they let him work anyway." Leila, devastated by the new revelations, Saturday holding Aya's diary. Inside were naive, but so important to her, entries about how she wanted to become a doctor to save people. She read her daughter's words, and her pain intensified with each line. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did they let this man decide her fate?" She felt betrayed, not just by Phillips, but by the entire system that had sworn to protect life. The investigation uncovered other egregious cases. It turned out that a few years ago a woman with dark skin died after Phillips refused to operate on her. But at the time it was written off as a lack of evidence and decided not to publicize it. These facts were a cold shower for anyone who believed that medicine remained a hate-free field. Each new case was like another nail in the coffin of trust in the hospital. That allowed it to happen. Meanwhile, protests continued on the street, but they became even more tense. People who had learned of the new details shouted the names of those who had covered up for Phillips, demanded a complete restructuring of the system and the firing of all those involved in silencing the complaints. The crowds did not disperse, but grew larger. People brought pictures of their own loved ones who had suffered medical racism and shared stories they had previously been afraid to tell. Sarah, a young nurse, now felt part of this movement. She could no longer stay on the sidelines. That night she took the microphone and, standing in front of thousands of people, said, "We all knew what he was like. We were all afraid to speak out, and because of that we became complicit. But silence kills. We must fight for change, for those who could not be saved, but whom we might save in the future." Her words were met with applause, but her heart still ached with guilt. Phillips, after learning of the new round of accusations, was still confident of his immunity. He locked himself in his house, protected by a team of lawyers, and tried to ignore protests. He felt no remorse. He believed that the hatred that drove his decisions was justified, and that made him all the more terrifying. But even his lawyers knew the case was becoming increasingly hopeless. Public opinion demanded justice, and it was clear that no amount of justification could erase the fact that his hatred had taken a life. All this time, Leila and Marcus continued to fight for the memory of their daughter. Their pain became a symbol of the struggle for justice. They knew that Aya could never be brought back, but they hoped that her death would be the last link in the chain of hatred they must break. Their daughter had to live, but now they were fighting to make sure that no child would ever again fall victim to the hatred behind the white coat and the oaths that had become empty words. For several weeks, the hospital was in the center of national attention. Public pressure, support from activists, and constant revelations forced the hospital's management to take action. Finally, The day came when the directors' meeting made its decision. The people outside the building frowned in anticipation, and protesters held their breath, knowing that every moment of this day could be decisive. Dr. Phillips was officially dismissed in disgrace. His dismissal was not a mere formality, but a symbol of the deep guilt felt by the hospital and its management. He was stripped of his medical license, and the decision itself was accompanied by loud statements emphasizing that his actions were inexcusable and contrary to all medical ethical standards. For many, however, this punishment seemed too weak. People wanted to see more, not just a dismissal, but justice that could truly heal the wound inflicted on society. Phillips left the hospital building, surrounded by security guards. The crowd that had gathered met him with angry shouts, hurling accusations and condemnatory words in his direction. His face was stern and tense, but there was no shadow of remorse in his eyes. He walked without looking back, as if trying to keep his pride intact despite everything that had happened. The crowd parted, leaving him a narrow corridor, but every step echoed with anger and contempt. A young woman standing at the edge of the crowd threw a flower toward Phillips. It was not a gesture of reconciliation, but an act of symbolic accusation. "This is for Aya," she said, her voice shaking with rage, "for the child whose life was taken by your hatred." Phillips held his step for a moment, but then he continued walking, without a word, without expressing an ounce of remorse. This was a man whose cruelty could not be washed away, even in the face of such public condemnation. Shortly after the event, the hospital issued a statement. It was cold and official, but it did say that they would learn lessons from the tragedy. The management promised comprehensive reform to prevent similar incidents in the future, but many felt it was just an attempt to save their reputation. Leila and Marcus, upon hearing this statement, felt even more pain. They knew that no words would bring their daughter back to them, that no promises would undo what had already been done. Aya's parents Saturday by her small grave. The weather was overcast, and a cold wind blew against them as if the world itself, was mourning the girl's death. Leila gently adjusted the flowers on the grave, her hand still shaking with tears. "They think getting fired will fix everything," she whispered, looking at the headstone with their daughter's name on it. "But nothing can fix the fact that she'll never smile again, never play again, never grow up again." Marcus Saturday beside me, silent and broken, his eyes stared into the void, and he seemed like a man who had lost the meaning of life. "We were promised justice," he finally said, "but there will never be justice. It was taken from us, and now we live in a world that will forever be broken." Leila reached out and they held hands, as if it was the only thing they had left supporting each other in this sea of pain. Meanwhile, conversations began within the hospital that firing Phillips did not solve all the problems. Young doctors and nurses demanded real change, reforms that would make the medical system fair for all. The old system that covered up hate and allowed races to continue to operate had to be broken. But that was harder than just firing one person. It meant confronting the deep roots of bias that many were afraid to acknowledge. Sarah, the nurse who had felt guilty about what had happened for so long, was now at the forefront of the movement for change. She and other health workers organized seminars and meetings to discuss how to make medicine safe for everyone. But every night when she returned home, she felt the weight of responsibility for Aya. She couldn't forgive herself for not doing more when she had the chance. One evening, Sarah went out to the street in front of the hospital, where candles were still burning at Aya's makeshift memorial. People came and went, some leaving toys, others flowers as a symbol of a life lost. Sarah stopped in front of a picture of the girl, still looking on with the same bright smile that could melt the coldest heart. "We failed you," Sarah whispered, her tears streaming down her cheeks, "but I promise you that we will fight. We will fight so that no one else will suffer the hatred that took your life." The pain of Aya's parents, the tears of her friends, and people's fight for justice continued to remind everyone that this tragedy should not be forgotten. This was not just a story about racism in Edison. It was a story about how hate can destroy everything if allowed to do so. And while Phillips walked away in shame, the wounds inflicted by that hatred were still deep, and healing them will take time, effort, and perhaps a generation of change. Dr. Phillips despite his dismissal and public condemnation, remained a man, unable to accept his guilt. He continued to live in his spacious house, far from the protests and anger of the people who demanded justice for Aya. However, his peace was deceptive. Every day a crowd gathered outside his house, shouting his name with hatred and pain. People could not forgive the fact that not only had he allowed the death of a child, but he still had not expressed the slightest remorse. Phillips occasionally gave interviews, always with a face full of proud contempt. In one of these interviews, he Saturday in front of the camera in his office, surrounded by books and awards that now looked like symbols of his downfall. His voice sounded calm, but there was a venomous confidence in his words. "I never acted out of hatred," he said with faint sincerity. "I simply followed my professional principles, and what some people call racism is their interpretation, not the truth." These words caused a storm of outrage. Aya's parents, hearing his interview, felt their pain turn into something more devastating. Leela could barely hold back tears as she heard the man who refused to save her daughter try to justify his actions. "How could he be so cruel?" she whispered. "How can he speak of principles when he killed our daughter with his hatred?" Marcus couldn't hold back any longer. He stood at the window, fists clenched, his shoulders shaking with rage. "He doesn't even consider himself guilty," he said, his voice low and full of anger. "To him, she was nothing. To him, our lives don't matter. He talks about principles, but he himself has turned into a monster who covers his hatred with a medical robe." The psychological state of Aya's family was deteriorating day by day. Leela could no longer sleep. She spent nights at her daughter's bedside, cuddling her teddy bear, which still smelled of Aya. She thought her little girl was about to walk into the room, that it was just a nightmare she would wake up from. But with each dawning realization that it was reality broke her heart all over again. She became more and more withdrawn, barely responding to words of support from friends and family who no longer knew how to help her through this loss. Marcus, on the other hand, tried to find meaning in the struggle for justice. He went to protests, spoke to journalists, addressed politicians, demanding systemic reforms, but there was a void in his soul that nothing could fill. Every time he talked about his daughter, his voice shook, but he held on because he knew he had to be strong for Aya. She would want him to fight. She would want her death not to be in vain. While they suffered, Phillips continued to do everything he could to avoid serious punishment. His lawyers filed lawsuits to protect his reputation, claiming that he had been wrongly accused and was the victim of a witch hunt, but public opinion had long been against him, and every move he made only made things worse. On social media, people shared stories of how their relatives had suffered because of biased doctors, and Phillips' name became synonymous with evil. Meanwhile, one of the patients that Phillips had once treated decided to come forward with an expose. It was a man named James who had a similar story, but fortunately it didn't end in death. "Phillips once refused to treat my brother," he told the Aya Memorial gathering. "He said his time was worth more than my brother's life. We struggled to find another doctor, and we were lucky, but I know our story could have ended the way Aya's did. We were just one step away from tragedy." These words were met with heavy silence. People could not believe that Phillips not only had not repented, but had continued to defend his hatred under the cover of his professional convictions. Sarah, a nurse who had long struggled with guilt, felt that heavy weight again. She knew that doctors and nurses should be the last line of defense for patients, but here they had become part of the problem. One night, as Leela Saturday in Aya's room, there was a knock on the door in the silence. It was Marcus, holding a box of their daughter's belongings. "I found her drawings," he said, and his voice broke. Leela opened the box and saw a drawing of Aya showing herself in a white robe with a smile on her face. Underneath the drawing was written, "When I grow up, I will become a doctor and save lives." Those words were unbearable. They were those dreams that were now impossible. Leela burst into tears, her hands shaking as she held the drawing. She wanted to make this world a better place. She whispered. She believed in people, and they betrayed her. Marcus put his arm around her and they Saturday together, hugging, surrounded by things that would never come to life again. Their daughter was gone, and no amount of tears or words could bring her back. But even in their pain, they knew they could not give up. They knew they had to keep fighting. They had to get justice, not just for Aya, but for all the children whose dreams might have been shattered by hate. After Dr. Phillips was dishonorably discharged and stripped of his license, his life rapidly deteriorated. The press covered his downfall relentlessly, and public censure became a constant torture. His home, once a peaceful sanctuary, became a place of perpetual protest, and every night was filled with the screams of people demanding justice for Aya. Accusatory writings appeared on the walls of the house, and windows were pelted with stones. Phillips could no longer go outside. Without security, his friends turned their backs on him. His co-workers avoided meeting him, and even those who used to support him could no longer be seen near his shadow. But even in this chaos, Phillips showed not a shred of remorse. He continued to shut himself away in his world, convincing himself that he was the victim of injustice. "I've always followed my principles," he told his lawyers, who had less and less faith that he was right. "I did what I thought was right." But now his words sounded hollow, like an echo in a room full of darkness. His destroyed reputation became a symbol of how hate can destroy the lives not only of those who suffer from it, but also of those who carry it in their hearts. His name became a disgrace, and people in the town whispered of him as a monster who once walked among them, hiding his malice behind a white coat and a Hippocratic oath. The town where he had once been respected now rejected him. Meanwhile, Aya's family continued to relive their tragedy, the pain of which did not subside. Leela and Marcus tried to support each other, but every morning was a new challenge. Leela could no longer find comfort in anything. She refused to go back to her job. Her life had become an endless wait for a miracle that would never come. She sat by the window, watching the children running down the street. And each time her heart broke at the thought that her little girl would never be one of them again. Marcus tried to find meaning in his fight for justice. He became more and more active in protests and meetings with politicians, trying to get real reforms in the medical system. But it wasn't bringing his daughter back to him, and he knew it. His soul was scarred, and every time he heard people tell their stories of racism and injustice, it reminded him that Aya was victimized not just by one person, but by the entire system that allowed hate to flourish. One day Marcus came home. After a long day full of meetings and performances, he entered the house, where there was dead silence. Leela was sitting in the living room, her face pale, her eyes fixed on one point. In her hands was a note that Aya had left when she was only 6 years old. In that note, the little girl had written, "Mom and Dad, I love you very much. I want us to always be together, and I want to be able to protect you." Marcus sat her down next to his wife, and they both began to cry, their tears mixed with memories of their daughter's love and innocence. At this time, changes began to take place at the hospital. The new management announced that mandatory bias training would be introduced and promised to change the rules so that racism could not so easily creep into medical practice in the future. But many staff knew that wasn't enough. Too many had already suffered, and for too long hate had been part of their daily lives. Sarah, a nurse, was still struggling with guilt. She knew that her silence had also played a part in this tragedy. She had seen how other medics tried to justify their actions, how some of them said they couldn't do anything, but Sarah knew that was a lie. They could have done more. They could have dealt with the hate earlier, instead of waiting for it to take a child's life. One day, Sarah decided to visit Leela and Marcus. She stood at their door for a long time, hesitating to knock. Finally, she plucked up the courage to ring the doorbell. Leela opened, her eyes red from crying, but there was no anger in her gaze. Sarah began to speak, her voice trembling. "I came to tell you that I'm sorry. I know my words won't bring Aya back, but I want you to know that I'm guilty too. We're all guilty, and I promise I will fight to make sure this never happens again." Leela was silent, her eyes filled with tears, but then she nodded slowly and invited Sarah in. They sat her down in the living room, and for the first time in a long time, Leela felt that she was not alone in her pain. Sarah told her about her fears, about how she couldn't sleep at night knowing she could have done more. Leela listened, and though her pain didn't go away, she realized that she now had allies who were willing to fight for her daughter's memory. "Phillips," learning about how his former colleagues continued to fight for justice, felt his world shrinking. He was surrounded by hatred, but not the hatred that fueled his decisions, but the hatred that was now returning to him. His life was ruined, his reputation destroyed, but none of these consequences awakened remorse in him. He remained a broken man who had never been able to realize that his hatred had cost a child's life, and that for every one of Aya's shattered dreams, he was now responsible. But for Leela and Marcus, justice was still far away. They knew that even if Phillips was punished, even if the system changed, they would have to live in a world without their daughter, and that was the hardest truth they had to put up with every day. The memories of that terrible day, when Aya had fought for her life in the hospital room, still haunted Leela and Marcus. They couldn't forget how their daughter, so small and fragile, clung to every breath as her heart grew weaker with each beat. It was an agonizing moment, imprinted in their minds like an unbearable wound that would never heal. Aya was always a child who radiated light and joy. Her smile could light up any room, and her laughter was contagious and spread throughout the house, filling it with warmth and happiness. She loved to draw rainbows of color, build sand castles in the park, and dream of a future in which she would become a doctor to save people. She believed in goodness and that the world was full of miracles. Her faith was unshakable even when she faced hardships. But the day she needed urgent help, her life depended on the decision of a man who had only evil in his heart. When Aya was brought to the hospital, she was still conscious. Her eyes, usually full of curiosity and fun, were filled with fear. She couldn't understand why her body had betrayed her, why she couldn't breathe like she used to, why her heart hurt so much. Leela, holding her hand, tried to hide her tears so as not to frighten her daughter. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice shaking. But Aya knew something was wrong. She was a smart girl, and in her eyes she read the question, "Mommy, am I going to die?" Marcus, who had always been her hero, stood beside her, hands clenched into fists, feeling utterly helpless. He couldn't protect his daughter from the disease like he'd protected her from the monsters in her childhood fears when she'd asked him to stay with her until she fell asleep. He was ready to give his life just to keep her alive, but all he could do was stand by and hope the doctors would perform their miracle. But that miracle didn't happen. Aya, the girl who fought with all her might, never got help because the doctor who could have saved her turned away. Dr. Phillips entered the room, saw her, but his eyes, instead of expressing compassion, were cold, almost indifferent. It was the look of a man who did not see the child before him, did not see the little girl who was to have her whole life ahead of her. He saw only the color of her skin, and that determined her fate. Aya could feel the pain getting worse, her body getting weaker, but she still clung to every hope. She didn't want to die. She wanted to play with her friends again, to hug her parents, to laugh and dream of what her future would be like. Her hands, which had grown so cold, clutched Leela's arm as if begging her not to let go. But even her mother, with her boundless love, could not hold her daughter. The nurses tried to stabilize Aya's condition, the machines beeping, warning that her heart was failing. The doctors panicked, knowing that every moment could be their last. But Dr. Phillips didn't come. He turned his back on the child who needed him most because the hatred in his heart was stronger than his oath, stronger than his humanity. He made a choice that condemned Aya to death. Leela remembers the last time Aya looked at her, her eyes already clouded over. "Mom," she whispered. It was the last word her small lips could utter, and it was torn between pleading and fear. Her breathing became ragged, her heart frowncy. A minute her life faded away. Leela screamed, her scream filled with such pain that it seemed the world should have stopped. But the world kept moving, indifferent to this family's grief. Marcus fell to his knees, feeling his heart break. He couldn't believe that their little girl was no longer with them. She, who had always been their joy, who had dreamed of the future, now lay lifeless, and no amount of praying, no amount of screaming could bring her back. Her struggle for life, her hopes, her dreams, all of it was gone, like the light of a star extinguished in a dark sky. But even after her death, the tragedy didn't end. It only exposed the depth of the racism that had taken away the most precious things from this family. Aya's story was a reminder of how hatred can kill, of how indifference can destroy families, Every time Leela and Marcus remembered how their daughter fought for life, they realized it wasn't just a fight against illness. It was a fight against the hatred that made this death inevitable. Although they could not save their daughter, they knew they had to do everything possible to make sure her death was not in vain. A few months have passed since the terrible day when Aya's life ended in the hospital room. But for Leela and Marcus, it is as if time has stopped. Their home, which had once been filled with children's laughter and the sounds of joyful play, had become cold and silent. Every room was a reminder of someone they had lost. Everything was still in its place in the nursery. The toys she loved, the books with brightly colored covers, her school backpack, never opened since that day. A blanket with drawings of her favorite fairy tale characters still lay on the bed. Leela often Saturday there, holding the blanket close to her, as if trying to feel her daughter's presence. At night, Leela could no longer sleep. She wandered around the house, touching Aya's things, as if she was afraid they would disappear like her little girl had disappeared. She whispered prayers, trying to make sense of her pain, but there was no answer. Why? She asked the void over and over again, but all she heard in response was silence. She blamed herself, blamed the system, blamed everyone who had let hate win that day. But most of all, she blamed Dr. Phillips, whose hatred had taken her child. Marcus, who seemed strong on the outside, was broken on the inside. He tried to support Leela, but he was on the edge himself. Every night he went out into the yard, looked up at the stars, and remembered how he and Aya had often watched the sky together. "Daddy," she used to say, pointing to a bright star, "that's the star that will shine for us forever." Now that star seemed to him a reminder that his little girl would never see it again. He often spoke to her as he looked up into the night sky, apologizing for not being able to protect her. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking with grief. "I should have done more." But most of all, Marcus was tormented by hatred. It was eating him up inside, reminding him every day that his child had died because of a man who had made a conscious decision not to save her. That fact poisoned his mind, made him want revenge. But he realized that even revenge wouldn't bring his daughter back. He saw the hatred destroying him, just as it had destroyed their family, but he didn't know how to free himself from it. From time to time, Leela and Marcus tried to return to their usual activities, but life seemed meaningless to them. Neighbors and friends tried to support them, bringing them food, inviting them to parties and meetings. But the Aya family could no longer feel joy. One day their closest neighbor, an elderly woman named Miriam, stopped by with a basket of cookies. She looked at Leela standing by the window and didn't know what to say. "Leela, you have to eat," she reminded her gently. But Leela only nodded, her eyes remaining blank. No words could bring back her appetite or will to live. One day Leela decided to go again to the park, where she and Aya had so often spent time. She thought that if she went back to the place where her daughter was happy, she would feel at least a little better. But that was a mistake. The park was full of children laughing and playing, their ringing voices filling the air. Leela watched them and felt the pain tearing her heart to pieces. She remembered how Aya used to ride the swings, how she used to run to her with a smile, how she used to lift her head to the sun, happy with every moment. Leela couldn't take it anymore. She collapsed to her knees in the very spot where her daughter had once played and screamed. Her scream was full of such desperation that the people around her frowned, not knowing how to help her. It was the cry of a mother whose soul could not be healed. Marcus, hearing about what had happened in the park, came to get his wife. He found her sitting on the ground, crying, and he didn't know how to comfort her. He put his arms around her, pulling her close to him, and they sobbed together. Two people who had had part of their souls ripped from them. It was a pain that did not subside, but only grew worse with each passing day. Meanwhile, the public outcry over Aya's tragedy continued unabated. People still took to the streets, demanding justice, but it seemed to Marcus and Leela that justice would never be achieved. Yes, Phillips had been fired. Yes, the hospital had made reforms, but what good was it if their little girl couldn't be brought back? They felt helpless, tired of the endless struggle. One such day, Marcus sat her down at an old desk and began to write a letter. It was a letter to his daughter, a letter to a future she would never see. My dear Aya, oh, his hands trembling. You were our light, our happiness, our hope. We were supposed to protect you, but the world proved too cruel. I promise that we will fight for you so that your death will not be in vain. You deserve to see what this world could be, and we will try to make it better, though it will never be as bright without you. Leela walked over to him, her eyes still full of tears. She put her arm around Marcus's shoulders and read his letter, her arms wrapped around him, and they cried together. It was the only thing they could to now share their pain and hold onto each other as the last thread linking them to the past, where Aya was still alive. Hate had taken away their most precious possession, but they knew they had to keep living, if only for the sake of their daughter's memory. They had to make sure that her name was never forgotten, that her story changed the world, even if they themselves could no longer feel it as they had when Aya was still with them. A year had passed since Aya's death, but the pain of her loss was still alive in the hearts of her parents. Leela and Marcus felt that their lives would never be the same, and everything they did was imbued with the memory of their daughter. A heavy weight of their tragedy stayed with them as a reminder that there was cruelty in the world that they could not cope with. On the anniversary of her death, they held a small ceremony in the park that Aya loved so much. Friends and neighbors gathered, as well as many who were touched by the tragedy and wanted to support the family. People stood with flowers, which were then laid at the base of the oak tree where Aya loved to play. Leela and Marcus stood side by side, shivering with grief and the chill of the fall wind, chilling them to the bone. It seemed to them that the sky itself was crying with them, shrouded in gray clouds, as if grieving for a little life that had been cut short too soon. Several activists spoke at the ceremony, talking about the fight for reforms in the medical system, about the mandatory bias training that has begun to be implemented in hospitals across the country. But even these words of change couldn't ease Leela and Marcus' pain. Every time they heard about progress, about reform, about justice, they felt that it was all too little, too late for their daughter. No words or actions could ever bring Aya back again, and this realization was eating them up from the inside out. At that ceremony, Marcus stepped forward holding a candle. He looked at the faces of the people who had gathered there and tried to muster all his strength to speak the words he had carried in his heart for so long. Aya was our light, he began, and his voice trembled. She believed in goodness, that the world was full of wonders, and she wanted to be a part of it, to make it a better place. But her dreams were taken away, and not just because of dullness. Her life was cut short by hatred, indifference, and a system that failed to protect her. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but it continued. We are here today not only to remember Aya, but to promise that her death will not be forgotten. We must do everything we can to make the world a different place, so that no other family experiences what we have experienced, so that no child will ever again fall victim to the hatred hidden under the mask of professionalism and indifference. People listened to him in silence, many of them wiping away tears. Leela stood nearby, her hands clutching the picture of Aya taken on her last birthday. She remembered her daughter blowing on the candles, laughing and making a wish. A wish that would now never come true. Leela felt her heart break with pain, but she knew she had to be strong for the sake of her daughter's memory. When the ceremony came to an end, everyone stood in silence, holding candles, whose light dispersed the evening darkness. It was a symbol of the light that Aya had brought into their lives, a light that would not fade, even despite the cruelty of the world. Leela and Marcus embraced each other, feeling that only in each other's arms could they somehow stay on the surface of this vast ocean of grief. Meanwhile, Dr. Phillips, whose life was now ruined, was in his house, consumed by his own hatred. He had lost everything: his profession, the respect of his colleagues, the opportunity to be who he used to be. But his heart still knew no remorse. He lived a reclusive life, hiding from a world that judged him, and couldn't understand why his life was ruined. He remained a man whose hatred, disguised as professional principles, had destroyed a bright life. But he could not accept his guilt. The following week, the hospital where the tragedy occurred installed a plaque in Aya's honor. Doctors and nurses now walked past it every day, and each time it was a reminder of what had happened and of what must never happen again. But for Leela and Marcus, That plaque was just a cold symbol. She couldn't hug their daughter, couldn't smile at them like Aya did. Aya's story lived on in people's hearts as a reminder that racism and hatred still exist, even in places where they should have no right to exist. This tragedy was an echo that made people think and change their views, but it also left a deep wound that could not be healed. Leela and Marcus knew that they could never get rid of this pain. They went on with their lives, remembering every day their little girl, who had fought so desperately for life, but had been betrayed by a world that could not protect her. This story ended tragically, but it became a message to all: never be indifferent, never let hate win. And while the world slowly changed, Aya's light continued to burn in the hearts of those who believed that even in the shadow of loss, strength could be found to fight. Dear viewers, we hope this story has made you think about the importance of compassion, justice, and equality. If you have experienced or witnessed racism, please share your stories in the comments. Your words may help others realize how deeply this problem permeates our society and inspire them to fight for change. You are incredibly important to us. Every comment, every reaction helps us not only grow, but also spread important messages that can change the world. I sincerely appreciate each and every one of you and are thrilled to have you as part of our community. Your support and feedback make a huge difference. If this story touched you, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and press the bell so that you don't miss new important stories. Thank you for being with us and for sharing your thoughts and experiences. We wish you a good day, full of kindness and understanding.